Hello, hi everyone. So we've got a few more people joining. Cool. So I'm gonna get us started. Sorry we're a little late. We had some technical difficulties all around, but we're going now and we're ready to start. So welcome to the second episode of the Livelihoods webinar series. We're so excited to have everyone here. If you were with us last week, welcome back. Thanks for continuing the conversation with us. If this is your first episode of the series, we're so glad to have you. You can check out last week's episode #1 on our YouTube channel. Just search Barista Guild on YouTube, and you should be able to find it. And it's a conversation on sort of how the Barista Guild Leadership Council decided to start having this conversation. So where this webinar was born from, and yeah, just how we got started on this topic of living wage for the hourly coffee worker. This has been a conversation that's been ongoing in other parts of the Specialty Coffee Association in regards to like producers and things, but we wanted to start this conversation about baristas and other people who work for hourly wages in coffee. So if you're interested in that, you can just search Barista Guild on YouTube, like I said. It should be the first video on the page, last I checked, but if it's not, it's called Livelihoods in Coffee, episode #1, the livelihood in coffee conversation. So this webinar is going to continue over the next couple of weeks. I'll kind of do a little overview of what's coming at the end today, but it'll be the same time, same place. Today, our episode is titled Living Wage / Living Income, the Concepts, and I'm very excited to introduce you to our presenter, Michelle Murray. She's joined us for webinars in the past. She's an internationally renowned expert on living wage and living income, and we're very fortunate to have her with us today. Thanks so much for joining us, Michelle, and we're ready for you if you are.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'm happy to be here. I love to talk about living wage and living income. I've been working on these issues exclusively for nearly a decade. And today what I'm really going to do is really try and explain these two concepts, how they apply in different ways, give a general sense of how all of that works. So if you want to move ahead one slide. The first thing I really wanted to touch on is one of the whys of living wage and living income. Why is this such an important issue to focus on? And I think that the COVID pandemic gave us a lot of sight into, hey, there's a lot of risk in jobs that can be strongly affected by events that are outside of our control. We need to think about the wages that people are earning and how it gives them resiliency and how they're able to weather those types of things. But the other thing that I just sort of want to draw this into in an international scope is, the world has decided to work towards these sustainable development goals that exist right now, and living wage and living income touches more of them than pretty much any issue that I can think of. And I'll go through how it does, but it really affects no poverty, zero hunger. It includes healthcare, so it looks at good health and well-being. It includes education, so it's quality education. It addresses gender equality because most of the time lower paid positions are filled by women. And so bringing that floor up starts to address some of the issues of gender equality. Clean water and sanitation included in the concept of living wage, and also sort of on the next row, number 8, decent work and economic growth. I mean, really the core of a living wage is about the decency of work and being rewarded for the work, and that it encourages further economic growth, that it is sort of a propulsion mechanism for communities, and also number 10, which is reduced inequalities. So that's a lot of things that the world has come together and said we'd like to address as our major goals as a global body that can really be dealt with through the concepts of living wage and living income. So go ahead to the next slide. So I wanted to share first, I pull these definitions from the Global Living Wage Coalition and the Living Income Community of Practice. And they're really based on research done by Richard Anker and Martha Anker, which has been leading the way on living wages globally. But the key that I wanted to sort of pull into this, as I was asked to talk about both concepts, is that they really have a fundamental core that's the same. So if you see the second paragraph in both of these definitions, it's going to say that both of these are talking about how do you achieve a decent standard living. They include the exact same items that are considered as part of a decent standard of living. And the only real difference is that when you're talking about the living wage, you're talking about paid workers who are wage earners and employees that receive enough remuneration, and I'll get to why it says remuneration and not just wages, for a standard work week to cover their expenses, right? And there are certain assumptions that we're going to talk about that go into that, about, well, is that for an individual or is that for a family, and how does all of that sort of play out? But it is a family concept, and so that's embedded in the very definition. And mainly this has been sort of the guiding light definition globally. It's what most people have come along to, and in coffee for sure, it has been what's been used in supply chains, and what is predominantly being used more and more in countries like the US and the UK and Canada and New Zealand, as well as a lot of producing countries. So the shared definition of living income is really where this concept goes a little bit different. And usually when we talk about living income, it's applying more to smallholder farmers. So my focus, since this is a Barista Guild thing, is going to be on the living wage piece, but I'm gonna give you a little bit of information on the distinction between those two, so you sort of understand when people talk about the living income concept, that with a living income, it comes into play, the same cost of living comes into play, but you don't have specific wages to weigh. So what you're looking at is the overall revenue of a family, and you're sort of taking out the expenses of them doing business for the farming, in order to understand how much is left that could sort of cover that cost of living. You could go ahead, by a slide. And all of these have sort of shared principles, right, of living wage and living income. And really to key in here is these concepts have been used in a lot of language in a lot of different places, and they're not always aligned. You know, sometimes it becomes sort of a, yeah, we're just going to fight for a living wage, and we just say we guess it is X. You know, the real truth of it is that there should be sort of rules behind it. And again, the anchors sort of put these rules forward, and they've been the most globally accepted rules. And they say things like, you know, hey, a living wage should be locally specific. It varies across different locations. It's not something that you can apply just with purchasing power parity across all the countries. It's a family concept. You can't really talk about someone earning a living wage or a living income if they can't feed their children, or they can't decide to have children because it's not even an option for them. It's basic but decent. So it's, you know, really clearly a concept that should be a floor and not a ceiling. It's not including, you know, just it's not saying everyone should be able to take tons of vacations every year. It's basically saying, how do you cover those basic needs that are at a decent level? And the concepts usually account for benefits that reduce the cost of living. So if it's a smallholder farmer, for example, in a living income environment, they might grow some food for their own consumption on the farm. And it would sort of account for that and say, well, it's a little bit lower cost of living because they don't have to pay as much for food. But for you all as baristas, it's accounting for what benefits you might receive from your employer, assuming that they actually reduce your cost of living. So if you're in the US where healthcare is a common benefit, that might reduce your cost of living if that's provided by your employer and they're not charging you too much to it or more than what you'd have to pay on the open market. If it's another country and your employer is making sure you have access to free childcare through vouchers, that kind of thing reduces your cost of living and therefore sort of credits towards the concept of a living wage. But I'm going to go a little deeper into these principles because a couple of them are really interesting and really specific, and I think the ones that are most easily misunderstood. And if you want to go forward. And the first of those is really this locally specific thing. So that applies both in standards of what is considered, you know, quote unquote decent, and also in the costs that come together. So basically, when we're talking about decency, you want to look locally specific, because in different countries, what's acceptable is completely different. If you're in India, a pit toilet is totally acceptable as long as there's good sewage and it's clean and it's healthy. In the US, it's culturally just not something that is commonly used. So it becomes sort of outside of acceptability. So there's a sort of sense of, what you can't apply the same idea of what's acceptable to two different locations. What you can apply is the idea that every place you go, for example, if you're saying housing, what's the cost of housing? Housing has to be protecting you from the elements. It has to be able to be healthy, so you can't have dirt floors where there could be mold growing and, different types of health hazards there. It has to be able to not have holes in the walls and in the ceiling where rain's going to be able to get in and you're not really protected. So acceptable housing is really, and all of these kinds of concepts that come into the living wage are really about looking at something that's going to give you the ability to live a quality life. What I have are standards in coffee growing areas in Guatemala, and I just sort of draw that out to say that they're, give an idea of what acceptable is. The top row, actually all of the housing on the top two and the one on the bottom left are not particularly acceptable. The one on the top left, they looked at it and it did do all of the elements of protecting from the elements, but it looked like it needed some repairs or it wasn't going to be doing that anymore. And in Guatemala, the bottom right picture is completely acceptable housing. It's not like living in a mansion, right? That's one concept that we're trying to get out here. So if you're somebody that's talking to your employer, let's say, and trying to encourage them to say, hey, you really need to look at this living wage, living income concept, I think the first key is to say these rates that are calculated, about what that is, they're not about things that are exorbitant. They really are about understanding what are basic costs of living. But the reason it needs to be locally specific is this standard that exists in Guatemala would not be the same standard in Canada. It wouldn't be the same standard in the UK. And there's a lot of differences, like I drew out in the type of toilets that might be acceptable in different locations and so on. The other part of locally specific, costs of living differ even within a single country. So I have here on the left a sort of chart of the different costs of living that go into the living wage estimates for a family in the US in different locations, right? And as you can see, they vary quite largely, right? So it's very difficult to say here's a living wage and that's the living wage for this country. It's a concept that really is super locally specific, and it reveals certain things about certain locations. You'll notice that here we have New York City costs are much higher than Mississippi and California costs in the US, but that in fact transportation costs, because it's a urban area and the transportation is sort of that gray bar, are a lot cheaper in New York City than they are in California or Mississippi, where someone would have to own a car. Elsewhere, they take public transportation here. Those are I say here because I'm in New York, sorry everyone. But those are the kinds of differences that what understanding living wage is really going to draw out and really help an employer understand. And then they can help to understand what are the big costs that we can help cover by providing benefits. If you'll see, the biggest bar in New York is childcare. If you had an employer in New York and they were really trying to make sure that they covered the costs of a decent living, providing vouchers or reimbursements for childcare would make a huge difference. And that's what the concept of living wage is supposed to bring out, is really the understanding and the information about how you can make sure the workers, all coffee workers, are able to achieve a decent living. So if we go ahead, one slide. Great. The next part of the concept that I've been talking about is this is a family concept. Now, that's a really important piece. I think that there are a lot of people out there and a lot of employers out there that say, well, my workforce or my baristas are primarily single and they don't have children. And I hear that from a lot of different industries. And so why should we have to think about living wage as a family concept? Shouldn't we have it be more reflective of who I hire? And the answer is always no, because if you want to be able to have an industry that can be just have that professional nature that it deserves and have the respect workers deserve, every employee should be able to make a choice about whether they want to have a family and not have to make the decision that as long as I'm in this job, I can't afford to have kids. Or, and so I'm either going to stay in where I'm at, or I'm going to have to try and find something else to do, regardless of how much I love this, because I'm not being paid enough to support my family. And so I can't move forward. So really, living wage is always a family concept that looks at the typical family size in a given location. It usually doesn't drop below 2 adults, 2 children. There's a few exceptions in China, for example, but usually it's around 2 adults, 2 children, and that covers the replacement rate as well for the population. And then it looks at the number of workers per family. So it's assumed that there's 1 full-time worker, and it looks at the statistical likelihood in a given area that a second person will be working in the family and sort of adds that in. And so when you're looking at a living wage, it's always having these sort of underlying, or should always have these sort of underlying assumptions that, hey, you're not having, it's not telling you that you'll earn enough. I mean, I'm a single parent, and it doesn't tell me that I'm going to earn enough as a single parent to support both myself and my 2 children if I'm earning a living wage. It says that if I'm in a family with a couple, that both one is working full time and one's working what is, you know, statistically likely in that area, that we would be able to support our family if we were both earning a living wage. So again, it gets down to the idea that if you're talking to someone about this, it really stresses that this was put together in a way that's very basic and still can ensure decency. I'll just draw out another difference on the living income concept, which is it's looking at household size instead of family size. Because those are usually smallholder farmers that are usually included in this concept, it calculates all the income that comes in under the roof, which is sometimes a more extended family. So it's a slightly different concept, but not so much. You can move ahead. All right, so this slide's going to show you what is a living wage, right? All the things that we had in the definition before, what really goes into calculating a living wage. And it's about understanding these different costs of living, these different really essential costs of living, like food, housing, healthcare. If you're in a country like the US, that includes insurance and out-of-pocket. You know, if you're in a country where you have healthcare provided by the government, it's going to include whatever sort of pieces you're having to typically pay on the outside. Childcare costs or education costs for children are included, transportation costs, other costs, and those are usually like small margins for books or for clothing and soap and household items, and internet access, which has been more important than ever to think about including in an age where, you know, many kids around the world have needed the internet to go to school because of COVID. So, and then the last one is unexpected events. And I put COVID there because it's become so clear. I used to talk about what living wage and living income was in a sort of pre-COVID world. And I always said unexpected events and explained, well, weddings or funerals, but I think COVID has brought into stark contrast that having some sort of margin to put away for things that come up that you couldn't prepare for is really essential in getting through difficult times for anyone, and really a part of thinking through, is anyone paying their employees a basic level of decent wage? So all of those sort of go together, and then add on taxes that come into payroll taxes and divide that whole cost of living with taxes and everything by the number of workers per family. And then you're getting what is the really gross living wage that's estimated out. And this is basically what we mean when we're talking about what a living wage is, so that you can cover all of these costs and all of these expenses. And you can move forward one, please.
Sorry, Michelle, we had a question that I missed. It was about the graph from Kate, and she wanted to know if the numbers were in dollars.
Yes, they were in dollars.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure. So the next example I want to show is this is for the US living wage certification that I've been working on, and that's launching in November. It gives a clear example of how benefits can really count towards a sort of living wage. And when you're thinking about, well, am I earning enough to support myself and my family? Am I earning a living wage? And I'm looking at different benchmarks, or you're talking to an employer and saying, hey, how can we make sure that everyone that we're working with is earning a living wage here? Some of the things that you're going to think about are, what are the benefits that they provide and how can they account towards that? And this is a specific case that I looked at for a specific employer in Chicago that was paying a cash wage of $15.79 an hour, but had pretty extensive benefits on top of that that reduce the cost of living for their workers significantly, and therefore could sort of credit towards what a living wage is. That said, there's a lot of other benefits that are really important and really great that we don't count into the concept. Things like if you're getting college tuition paid for, that's important, that's great, but we didn't include the cost of college tuition in a living wage estimate. No one does globally, not just us here in the US, but and in any of the anchor methodology benchmarks that are used in supply chain countries, or the UK Living Wage Foundation, which does living wages in the UK, the cost of a college education is not always a core piece of this. So we don't look at things like, how can we credit those types of benefits? Some systems that look at living wages won't credit benefits at all. The UK is one example, and oftentimes those are cases where a lot more sort of social benefit is provided by the government. Here in the US, benefits become a huge part of pay packages where they might not in another place. So that gives sort of that example. If we want to move forward to the next slide. And this is the example of just telling you how living income works differently. This slide actually comes from the Living Income Community of Practice. It's a group of organizations and companies and others that are working on living income in supply chain countries around the world. And really, the green part that you see of the living income benchmark is the same as what I just explained in the living wage, the cost of living. The cost of living doesn't change based on whether you're getting a wage or you're directly running your own small business, right? So the living income concept, for example, if you ran a small coffee shop, that's going to apply to you. The living wage concept is going to apply to all the workers that you employ. But the cost of living in the area is going to be the same for both of you, and you both want to be able to make sure that you're covering that. So for a living income, they're looking at, your net income from all the activities you do. In this case, because it's using sort of a coffee farmer case, the net farm income, then off-farm income and other income that you might have in all different sources. And where that adds up and then sort of subtracts out, so it's net income. So you've already subtracted out all your expenses and all your cost of production. You can see where your gap is in that way from a living income concept to a living income benchmark. So I'm going to put this in a sort of coffee house concept. If I owned my own small business and I had 2 or 3 coffee houses, and I looked at what all my expenses were after I ran those and all of my revenues were, and looked at that sort of profit and said, does that then reach the income necessary for my family and that income benchmark? Then you know that that owner is earning a living income. But part of thinking about that is, am I paying every single worker within my system a living wage? Am I making sure that everyone else can have that basic standard of decency as well? And so these two concepts sort of work together from a business owner and with their own workers, so that a business owner can assess, am I getting enough to earn a living income in the business model I have? And I can't claim that that's the case if I'm not making sure that includes the cost of paying every worker a living wage. So we can go ahead to the next slide. Oh, that's it for me. So that, in a nutshell, is what the basic concepts are behind a living wage and a living income, what they cover, what goes into the calculation, how they sort of differ from one another, what types of things count towards payment of a living wage, how it's both wages and, you know, potential benefits that might cover. I lost the system for a second. Sorry, how they tie together for both someone who might own their own business and those that work for them. So I'm gonna pause there and see if there are any questions. It's a lot of information in a short period of time that I can answer.
Cool, thank you so much, Michelle. Yeah, any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box and we'll see those. I have a question just to start us out. We kind of talked a little bit about the pandemic, but how do you think the pandemic has changed the idea of living wage moving forward?
Oh, I think that's an excellent question. So, you know, I think that it remains to be seen whether the same impact happens globally that is happening in the U.S. And a few other spots, but I'll go through some of the sort of twofold things that are occurring. One, I think the awareness raising on living wage as an issue has gone through the roof. Everyone is sort of understanding very, very clearly that, hey, you know, a lot of what we're considered frontline workers, and I'm not really talking just about doctors and, you know, paramedics. I'm talking about baristas that are having to be exposed or look at or try to work with customers on a daily basis and take on risks. You know, same thing goes for grocery workers, others that are sort of exposed to other people on a regular basis through this. There's been a lot more awareness that, hey, you know, these jobs need to be rewarding the people who are working in them at a much higher level. And I think that there's been an increased empowerment of workers globally to say, like, hey, we want to be paid a decent wage because this was just an unreasonable thing to go through. And in my experience thus far, businesses have been talking about living wage massively more than they used to. Their interest has peaked considerably. They're suddenly saying, well, we're building back now, but it's the concept of building back better. And we want to make sure that we're dealing with some of the problems that really COVID shined a bright light on. And one of them was that a lot of workers are not earning a living wage globally. It's just a fact, you know, and that when something that is really disruptive comes into play, like COVID, people are really struggling to get through that. And I think that that sort of you know, cognizance that came into play has made a total difference globally in the way people are thinking about this. Now, the second step that I said, I think it remains to be seen whether it plays out everywhere, but it's certainly playing out in the US, is there's suddenly a labor shortage once everything starts to open up and people start to get vaccinated and things are moving quicker. There's suddenly this supposed labor shortage. But the fact of the matter is that it really seems to be a wage problem, not an actual labor shortage. So I work with one employer that was really having difficulty recruiting, and they thought, you know, we're paying pretty well now. We're paying $17 an hour in the US, and that, you know, that's good, well above a minimum wage. And we talked about getting up to a living wage level and how they might be able to do that. And as soon as they did that, if they switched to a living wage, people automatically were able to that figure and say, okay, I can live off of that. Like, I can have a long-term job in that, and that can make sense for me for years to come, and I'm not going to be in a bad position. And so suddenly recruiting was no problem at all. They were getting, instead of, this was a maid service, and instead of getting sort of unemployed and underemployed people, they were getting managers from McDonald's. You know, they were getting, like, it was just a totally different situation that was coming in the door. And so I think that there's going to be sort of more of this understanding that workers are really looking for something they can depend on, and that's going to allow them the opportunity to be supported. And I think COVID did that a lot.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I think, yeah, that last example that you gave about having a employment shortage, people are making more, staying at homes and looking for jobs. So they want to look for those jobs that are going to pay them as much or more. So yeah. Totally see that. We have a couple other questions coming in. We've got another one from Kate. How do we work together to communicate this information to employees, specifically all that's included in calculating living wage?
Yeah, I mean, I think so to communicate it from employees, so for the perspective of an employee communicating to other employees, perspective of a business owner, an employer communicating to other employees. Either way, I'll sort of go at it from either way. Is, I think really what, if you're looking at this as an employer saying, how do I talk to my employees about what I'm trying to achieve in terms of paying a living wage, and how do I put the word out there? There's lots of ways to communicate that. In a lot of different countries, there are certifications for living wage where you could communicate to your employees and potential employees exactly what that looks like in the location where you're at. So there's the UK Living Wage Foundation in the UK. There's a couple of regional ones in Canada. There's one in New Zealand. There's one coming up in Hong Kong, and one in South Africa coming up. And, they're sort of popping up everywhere. I'm launching one in the US in November. So there's a lot of different ways that an employer can really understand and indicate if they're actually paying a living wage, what that means to all of their workers by using those standards, because they sort of really clearly delineate what does this mean, right? I think if it's about employees sort of talking to other workers and trying to build up that interest to talk to employers, I think that the key is really knowing, look, if we're talking about a living wage, let's have the conversation together about the things that are essential to our lives, and think about that and see how those are reflected in how living wage estimates are brought about, right? There's easy ways if you want. It's easy to have, if you want sort of handouts and infographics and slides and things like that. I mean, that's certainly something that I think is a good role for the Barista Guild to put together, is, hey, there's a communication package. I'm always happy to help with that you can take to either your employees or your employer or other workers that you work, your colleagues, in order to say, look, this is this concept that I think we really need to figure out how to get to. I will say this, it is not always something that's easy to get to in a day. There are huge gaps in some locations, and you saw the cost of living in New York City. There are huge gaps in some locations between minimum wage and a living wage. And so there's always sort of got to be this understanding that, okay, what we want to encourage is a commitment to living wage and advancement towards getting there every year. So wages going up to get towards that every year until you get there, rather than an expectation that everyone's going to be there on day one, because it takes some time to figure it out.
Thank you. Kate sent a follow-up that just to kind of clarify more of that question, that in her experience, it's not just a wage problem, but also a perception problem with what her employees were making as far as benefits and hourly pay. Employees still thought that living wage was just the base rate. So kind of trying to communicate everything that's included in living wage. But I think that idea of a communication package, whether we get to that in time for what, Kate, you're looking for, or if you wanted to come up with something like that for your employees and kind of share with them that information. I do feel like maybe this is just me thinking this, but that could maybe come off as a defensive of look, we're doing a good job. Any advice on how to go about doing that to make sure that it's not coming off as defensive of where you're at as an employer?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that, I think it's really key to have living wage. I mean, it might help me actually if I knew where Kate was located, but I'll give you, it's key to have an idea of what the living wage benchmarks are in the area, and to actually do the assessment, actually try to do the breakdown of how your pay is benchmarked against that living wage, right? And then to have a conversation with your workers about, and this is what we've clearly said is look, we think we're getting you there because we'll provide benefit and Y benefit, and they get you there, and have that conversation to be able to hear from them that, hey, you know what though, we don't want X and Y benefit, or we don't use X and Y benefit. You know, we need it. I think oftentimes it's about communication so that it doesn't cause that sort of defensive nature. It's more about saying, let's have an open channel about how what we're trying to achieve and how we're trying to get there for you. And then let's talk about how we've assessed this and what would happen if it changed. Because I think oftentimes there is a misperception about, oh, well, what is really the value of, you know, this healthcare benefit that I get in the US? And then, you know, you sort of have to show, well, this is what it would decency should include healthcare, right? And so if you're talking about what that's going to cost, and you're showing in those, you know, this is clearly what you would be having to pay if we weren't supplying this to you, you can start getting that conversation going rather than it saying, I'm doing this and that's just the way it is. I would say, you know, if anyone wants to follow up and contact me and has like specific questions, I don't know where everyone is, but there is always a body that can help through this in different locations, right? So if it's in the US, I'm happy to talk to you about how you can communicate with your employees, you know, and help you with that. If it's in a number of other countries, I'm happy to refer you to sort of the lead party on each one of those. I tend to stay hooked in globally to everyone that's working on this issue, or not everyone, no one can say everyone, but the vast majority of the organizations working on it. And so, you know, I'd be happy to help you through those kinds of things. I think it's a specific conversation, and it requires a good assessment of where you stand and what's counting where.
Cool. Thank you. We have another question from Angela. She says, does living wage mean the cost a houses need for living, therefore pair with the concept of living income? What should be provided for the wage? Just want to clarify the terms.
Sorry, I'm trying to understand. Can you read that one more time?
Yeah. Does living wage mean the cost of houses needed for living, therefore paired with the concept of living income, what should be provided for the wage?
So I think you're asking about the housing component, or I'm sorry, I'm not sure if the question is about whether it includes housing component, but the cost of living, I'll sort of pull this apart, for a living income and a living wage is the same. Okay, so the cost of housing is based on rents. It's not based on owning a house, unless you're in a country where rental in that area is just not typical, in which case they look at the cost of owning a house and amortize it over the life of the house, you know, the typical sort of lifespan, and come up with what is that typical monthly cost of the house to go into it. Now, of course, you have choice. You might be paying for your house, you might be paying, you know, renting it, whatever, but that basic amount that's added in there, it's the same in both concepts. The idea is, if I'm working for myself and I'm living next door to someone who is working for me, my cost for a similar sized you know, house or apartment or decent housing, and my cost for food and my cost for every other element are the same. It doesn't matter that one of us is making an income and one of us is making a wage. The costs of living are the same. The difference comes in with a wage. You're assuming that cost of living is divided out by the number of workers per family. So it's not one person earning all of that. With an income, you're counting all the incomes of all the people in the household as well, and from all the different directions, but you're also looking at the cost of doing business, the cost of business. Does that make, I hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. And Angela let us know. Oh, yeah. Okay. She said that was great.
Great.
So the next question we have is wage a problem that's equal all over the world in all countries?
Oh my goodness. It's not equal all over the world in all countries, but it is consistently there all over the world in all countries. So I'll tell you, I've worked, before I started working in the US, for example, I worked in 22 different countries around the world, and a lot of times there were huge gaps to from between a living wage and what wages were, for example, in agricultural workers, right? Giant, tremendous gaps, and there might have been more severe poverty caused in some of those countries than what I might see in the US. That said, though, the percentage of the overall population in those countries that were living on less than a living wage was often lower than what you'll see in the US, right? So they're different. The poverty might not be as severe in a wealthier country for the lowest level of wages that you'll see in a less wealthy country, but you might actually have more people that are just beneath, you know, that sort of living wage level where they're living paycheck by paycheck, trying really to get by and sort of struggling through that situation. It's a lot larger proportion of it there. So in the US, almost 50% of our population isn't earning a living wage. This is a very common, you know, situation. In countries like the UK or even in some countries like Ecuador, where the minimum wage is actually much closer to a living wage level, then you're going to see less people earning less than a living wage, right? That's just based on what the country's policy is. But nowhere in the world have I yet seen, you know, all workers earning a living wage, right? And everyone sort of living in a kumbaya of decency. So I think this problem applies in every single country, and that's why it's worthwhile looking at wherever you're located. How far am I? You know, how does my pay structure provide a gap to what a living wage would be in my specific location, or what a living income would be there?
That's very interesting about the higher percentage of people not earning a living wage compared to the poverty level.
Yeah.
It's great to know. The next question is there a certification in the US? And I'm maybe looking for clarification from the asker of if this is a certification for a business so that you can like share it, say like you're certified.
Yep. So there will be in November. So that is what I have been doing primarily and building for the last 3 years, is a US-based living wage certification system. We're getting our founding cohort of businesses together now to work with to launch in November. It's called Living Wage for Us, with the U and the S capitalized. It will be a certification. It will be a continual improvement. I am happy. Anyone who wants to have a conversation with me about that US-based certification, you know, please feel free to reach out. I think I don't know, we can share my email or any other way, but yeah, it's coming. And it's coming really soon, and it's 3 years in the making, and we've been pretty extensively actually engaged in coffee, and we already have our first certified coffee employer that's a roaster and a small chain of coffee shops in the US. So we're moving forward towards that, getting as many in for that founding cohort by November. And then we're aligning with the UK's Living Wage Week for the announcement, and really trying to get the word out to celebrate those employers that have taken this step. I think that's a big part of it, is making sure that consumers know that you're committed to this, making sure that investors know you're committed to this, making sure that potential employees know that you're committed to the concept of a living wage. So yeah, there will be very soon.
That's very awesome. Cool. I guess that's the end of the questions in the chat box. Oh, we just got another one. Oh, people are just asking for your information. And then people are interested in a copy of the presentation. I wonder, Michelle, if maybe you have some resources that you can direct them to that would have some of the information that you shared.
Yes.
Okay.
So I do. I'd love to know. I mean, if I get a sort of sense of where most people on this call are from, I'm able to better direct you to resources in different countries, to make sure that you're sort of able to access those. Maybe if we can get that list afterwards of just countries, I can start sending some of those places to reference. But I generally say that the Global Living Wage Coalition has a lot of living wage benchmarks in sort of the global south, so Asia, Latin America, Africa, and then there are organizations that are coming together as part of an affiliate group with the UK Living Wage Foundation. This US effort is the same for certifications, living wage certifications in some of the other countries that I mentioned, so I have contacts for all of them as well. If you want to see what the living wage rate is in your area and how that's fit for certification, I told you we're launching a certificate in the US. We are launching that in November, but we've put up a splash page with all of those rates so that you can get a sense of what those are, and we'll have a web page up in the next week. But those are at livingwageforus.org. So yeah, I mean, I'm happy to send sort of a whole, if I get a sense of where everyone is and what they're interested in, I'll send some very specific resources that you can share.
Great. Yeah, if everybody wants to, like, I don't know what kind of data we can track on who signed up where, but if you want more information, Michelle has her email there. You can also reach out to the Barista Guild. We have a contact page that comes to all the emails for the Leadership Council on the website, as well as social media. So you can definitely reach out to us, and we can help connect you so that you can get the information for your area.
Yeah, and I'm
gonna do that.
Yeah, and I mean, you can always just email me directly too if you have something for the specific question. I'm at michelle@livingwageforus.org.
And I'm in chat right now for everyone to see.
Great.
Awesome. Cool. Well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions, but I think people have further questions for you because they're asking for your contact info. Now we have it. Sorry, if you don't mind going back to the last slide, Laura, I just wanted to talk about the upcoming. Yeah, great. So next week we'll be here on GoToMeeting again. Thursdays, for me, it's 8 a.m. Pacific time, but whatever time it is now, an hour before that, wherever you are. And we're going to be talking about the business case for living wage next week. And then the week after, same time, same day, it'll be a panel on different approaches to living income and coffee. So people who've been able to do this in their businesses and the different approaches that they took to get there. And then the next slide, we have just all of the different handles. It's all the same handle on the different platforms that the Barista Guild is on, so you can reach out to us if you have other questions, or if you want to find the YouTube stuff to watch this again, or to see last week's episode. So yeah, that's it for today. Michelle, it was really, really great to have you with us again. I feel like I always learn so much every time you're with us. So yeah, thank you for joining us. Next week for episode 3, we're going to have a representative from the Living Wage Foundation to discuss why it's beneficial and important from a business standpoint to commit to paying your employees a living wage. So more on that next week, and we'll see you then.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.